Okay.
Right now, I'm starting because I'm so grumpy. I just can't control myself.
Yeah, he started arguing, and
we started arguing, and then Mark's like, "Wait."
This is Bob and Mark on Grumpy Science, and I had to put my glasses on because
he's gonna do something. He's gonna read.
I actually read this article. And,
these are my readers. $4.95 from Home Depot.
Mine were $3.
Gotcha. Because nothing that I read is worth more than that. So anyway, I'm super grumpy, sitting around getting more grumpy, and Mark said, just start recording. So we're starting. This is Bob and Mark.
We were trying to talk about
science.
The problem we were making was we were trying to prepare.
We don't do that. I was trying to say, I'm going to talk about it. He said, stop. Record it.
Okay, now
tell me what you're going to talk about.
Now tell me what you were going to talk about.
I'm going to talk about, there's an article that Mark found in Scientific
in the
American?
recent scientific. I do read, by the way.
Yes,
everyone. I get Scientific American. I still get the old kind of print articles, and found an article
Scientific American by a guy named John. I don't know him personally, but I've read his work. John P. Ioannidis.
And he's got a lot of tickers after his name.
And I'm going to put a reference to one of his papers we're going to discuss too. That's on PLOS, so you can we've got it up on another screen here.
Yeah.
And it's the title, just to let you know that we're not the only grumpy scientists out there.
So I read this. I said this guy's actually kind of grumpy.
Well, let's go ahead. I'll read the title to you. Okay. The other paper that he published in 2005, the title is "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." So,
answer is because.
And
the longer answer, he gives a longer answer.
Oh, he gives a long, statistically replete, scholarly answer to that question. And this is something that some of us scholars talk about all the time. Like, what's wrong with this system we're working in? Now, he has a certain, approach, and we respect and honor that. But Mark and I sort of disagree with some of it too. So we'll talk about the.
So the article is.
Rethink
Funding.
Rethink Funding.
The way we pay for science does not encourage the best results. We actually agree with that.
We agree with that, but I will say that rethinking funding is looking at the tip of the iceberg that's sticking out of the ocean. And 90% of the problem with science is not the way that it's funded.
It's who they fund.
It's who they fund and who it is at universities, hint, the administration, just saying, who distort, who they game these funding systems, and then they turn them into these multi-billion-dollar exercises in futility. And then they hire new faculty who are skilled at gaming the system. So any argument in science, I will just go on record as saying, any argument right now in 2018 that says you need to fund more science I think is wrong, because right now the way that the system works is it's bottomless. It has a bottomless capacity to waste money. So putting more money into it is not the answer.
Well, it's really good at sucking money out of everything else.
It sucks the marrow out of good scholars. So there we go.
Let's go over some of the things we agree with.
Okay, well let's go down the list.
First, he says we fund too few scientists, and then
the fact is there are too few scientists. Okay, there's a lot of people with PhDs who have faculty positions, and they're not scholars. They're not scientists. And just because this is sort of like this is the feeding the bears problem.
Feeding the bears?
Yeah, why do you not leave garbage out if you live in Churchill, Canada on the because polar bears will get into it, and you don't get rid of polar bears if you're living up in Canada by leaving turkeys, dressed turkeys out in your lawn. You don't sometimes. Putting resources into things makes the problem worse, all right? And unfortunately, the fact is that anything where the government has decided, the federal government, the United States government has decided to put money into it, an entire industry will grow around it to suck that money out. A good example is the regulatory industry. There's the FDA, and then there's an entire industry built around managing the FDA from the the industrial commercial side. And it's only there because there's so much money poured into this research and development from every direction. If the money wasn't there, the parasites wouldn't be there. So I disagree with that.
Okay.
We fund too few scientists.
Well, actually, he has his solution very similar to one you've talked about before, which is let's just fund all academics
right.
a certain amount and get rid of the NIH, but just write a check to everybody.
Right. So keep the funding low. I think we do better by having much lower levels of funding, spreading it out more equally to junior and intermediate and senior scholars alike, and then allow their scholarship to bubble to the top. Right now, all that universities judge your scholarship on is your research funding revenues. So if I'm getting $2 million a year and Mark's getting $4 million a year, according to any university, I'm just saying, just throwing numbers out there because those are not unreasonable.
I've never seen that many zeros.
I have, and you have too, so admit it. The fact is,
on somebody else's application.
Yeah, the fact is, okay, so say I'm getting some amount. I'll just say $2 million, and Mark's getting $4 million a year. According to any, especially medical school and academia in the United States, he's twice as good a scholar as I am, without any consideration for our actual impact.
He actually points this out in the article. That's his next point.
So he's right.
Is that he proposes using a lottery to decide who gets the money, and he also proposes a cap to maximum funding that any single person gets.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that.
Think about the way you treat the food in your kitchen and in your pantry when you get really low. You get really creative. I mean,
you get hungry.
Yeah.
Food is scarce.
Everybody that's been through school on peanut butter and jelly knows that.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be surprised what you can make with, like 3-year-old soy sauce and newspapers, right?
But but same thing. Creativity comes out of a little bit of angst and a little bit of need. And
the best research I've ever done was on $18,000 a year. Most of the papers I've ever written, most of the research advances I've ever made were made on a pretty slim budget. When you start to get more money, you have to put a lot more of your time and effort into maintaining that money and managing it. And research should not be terribly expensive.
Yep.
And Mark and I agree. And we agree with him.
Yeah, on that one. The next one is, he says, we do not reward transparency. That's true.
That is absolutely true. But
one is first, then his solutions revolve around things I don't necessarily agree with.
Well, when he says we don't reward transparency, what does that mean? Does he mean honesty or transparency in research?
Right. It means reproducibility.
Right. This is a huge thing in science.
Does some research and can't reproduce it. Then, we don't do any product placement here, but for example, if you take the brain gauge, which just happens to be a device that is fairly low cost as far as a research tool goes. We have lots of different research collaborators, and they get the same findings with our methods wherever they're used.
And when I ran a huge tissue engineering laboratory, which was, it was bigger than the BME department at our current university.
Yeah. My
laboratory at University of Michigan, had like 24 people in it. And I had very big funding from DARPA. And I had one rule, which was 100% transparency. If any legitimate researcher from any other university called us and asked for what was our protocol, what were our reagents, what did we do, we were 100% forthcoming. We didn't hold anything back. And you know what? We never got scooped. We never got ripped off by anybody. Credit was given where credit was due, and people were easily able to replicate our work. So we contributed, and I think that's important. But if you talk to many people now doing medical research, they won't share their reagents. They've got some secret sauce, like something they don't share. And if you're in academia and you don't tell people what you're doing, it's not science.
Yeah, sometimes it's what brand of apple juice did they use to train the monkeys?
Well, there was a big thing. There was a big thing. Like these guys were doing this X-ray crystallography of enzymes. And nobody could replicate their work. And they're like, well, we've got a secret reagent we use. It was really funny when I found out about it, because I knew one of the grad students. Their secret reagent was pickle juice. was like pickle, the water left over in a jar of pickles. And they were getting protein, enzymes to crystallize in this stuff, and nobody else could do it, and they weren't telling anybody for a long time. Now they do, and everyone knows it, But yeah, and it was sort of like they're getting all these results, but nobody could repeat them. So that's not science. That's something else.
So anyway, we agree with rewarding transparency, but sort of disagree with the solution, which is
what was the solution you took?
Create better infrastructure, and that's when I quit reading.
No,
it's like anytime you say
the last thing you need to do.
Creating infrastructure is another way of saying let's start a committee.
Let's start a committee, or let's build another building at a university.
We'll have the transparency university.
The system's broken, so let's not build lean-tos onto it, and stuff. It's just
God, he's gonna call us.
This guy's. I hope he's not a hater, because we're reading his stuff. Okay, John, we're reading your stuff because we respect you. All right, we don't agree with everything. Scholars understand. See, he understands. The scholars understand that you can disagree with somebody and still be good buddies with them. I disagree with Mark all the time. Wow. I don't tell you about it.
Yeah. Okay.
But you can, and you have a scholarly disagreement. But you'd think now in the public spheres, in politics, that disagreement is what do they call it now? Ever since the Newt Gingrich era, they call it anti-patriotic or something else like that. So if you disagree with somebody, all of a sudden you're a villain. But disagreement is
that's sort of the basis of our country.
Yeah, it's
for you international people, not domestic. We are in the U.S.
Yeah, you're allowed to, and in fact,
basically
encouraged to disagree.
Our nation was created based on rebels with
There are places where you're not allowed to, or encouraged to disagree. You better toe the party line, or you'll get abducted.
Okay. Next item is that we do not encourage replication in science, and sure,
that is so true. And there is a replication crisis.
So you do an experiment, you publish it, and then you go in for another round of funding. And if it's not creative or new, then nobody's interested in paying for it. One
of the biggest collaborations I ever had was with this guy who had tens of millions of dollars for research, and he would make these important findings and report them. And on one occasion, I sat him down. I said, "We really need to report that and replicate that and really make it solid." And he told me, he said, "I never replicate anything." He said, "I do it once, plant my flag, boom, and I move on because it's already proven." And that just shows he had no concept of what science really is. He said, nobody, and I've had my own advisor and many, many senior scientists say, nobody pays you to replicate somebody else's work. Nobody pays you to replicate your own work. So John is absolutely right here.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say, if I were, emperor of the NIH, what I would do is I would have 20% of funding would be for new work, high risk work, and high payback work, and at least 60% would be for replicating important findings.
You're skipping ahead here.
Am I?
Yeah.
It's because I have this huge throbbing brain now.
Well, I
can tell the future.
That's right.
Yeah, no, seriously, I would put more than half of all NIH funding to saying, okay, if you identify what you think is a really important finding, replicate it. We'll pay you to replicate it. And we will require, if that person who did the first thing, the initial finding has NIH funding, we'll require them to help you replicate it.
Yep.
That would fix a lot of research.
Okay. Next one's quick. He says, we don't fund young investigators, and the solution is to fund young investigators.
Oh, that's because they have all these new ideas, and they're all wrong.
Yeah. They don't know anything.
That is absolutely true. Funding goes to senior people, not because they're good, but because they sit on committees that decide on funding. So they feather their own nests. I know because I am one of these people, and I've sat on these committees, and a lot of them are good. Don't get me wrong. A lot of these people are really good. I'm not slamming them, but some of them really protect.
You know what the average age of the person's getting their first grant is now?
First grant age, you won't believe this. This is a big deal. Like, this is the beginning of somebody's scientific career. Is
46.
46. Okay, Now 46 years old is enough time that you can get a pretty reasonable pension from having served, in a government position. You can have 20 years in easily by 46.
Yeah.
What this is saying is that the typical academic researcher doesn't even come into like the beginning of their career really meaningfully until they're 46 years old.
So a lot of people used to say most famous mathematicians do their best work by the time they're age of 30.
Actually, yeah, some of my closest friends are mathematicians, and Dave Folk, who's a professor of mathematics at Eastern Michigan EMU, which is in Ypsilanti, told me the same thing. And I asked him about this. He said, no, look at Ramanujan or any of these famous mathematicians. Everything and he and I were arguing about tenure, which I was saying, it's crap, and people ought to be able to, justify their jobs for their career. They should have a job for life. And he said, well, and I respect Dave. I respect Dr. Folk a lot. He's a very close friend of mine from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he said, well, Bob, there are some fields in which people are just not productive past their youth, and one of them is mathematics. And he said it was 25. He said almost. I mean, you look at like Isaac Newton. All right, it was the age of 24, which I think was 1666. He was 24 when he did most of his really biggest stuff, and most major mathematicians.
I think Pascal was done at age 16.
Yeah, and Gauss, I think, was a big one. That was some of them are contributing well into old age, but some of them contribute. They burn out, and a lot of mathematicians die in their 30s. But because I don't know, something super hyper going on in their head. But this is true. This is really true, and yeah, it's taking way too long for people in medical research.
The solution to that is just find younger people.
I think that if I think it should be, if a university is willing to hire a person into their faculty ranks, that they should get a stipend, very modest, to do research.
Well, one of the biggest problems a bunch of years ago, I don't know if it still is, but well, it might still be. A few years ago, training grant money. That is money that goes to people getting their PhDs and postdocs, greatly outstripped what was awarded to first investigators, and so there was this huge number of postdocs.
So they're bringing people up. It's the polar bear problem, right? You feed a bunch of them, supplemental feeding, right? It's like feeding the deer. You end up with a lot of polar bears that get hungry because after they show up, you don't feed them anymore. So what happens?
And then they're shoved out on the iceberg.
That's right. So you end up with a lot of people with PhDs in the sciences in their mid and late 30s.
Okay, here's the part where we have a grumpy off, where you and I disagree with the author, where he says,
"That's right, John. We're gonna let John kind of
counter
on this."
But he says we use biased funding sources. Now, before we get into this too much, we should talk about what our idea is and what we think about crowdsourced science. Not crowdsourced funding of science.
Crowdsourced
but let's
execution.
Say, like we are very interested in doing a bunch of combined studies with the brain gauge and alternative treatment strategies, including pulsed electromagnetic field. Yeah. I can never say PMF. I always abbreviate it for 3 letters. But anyway, we want to do a lot of those studies where that would require transparency, because we'd be working with lots of different people on the same study, doing N of 1 studies. They basically case studies.
It's distributed. There's no opportunity for being opaque.
It would be a forum where, yes, they would have to have a brain gauge and a Micro-Pulse device to do the study.
Well, the studies we have in mind, but conceptually, philosophically, we're talking about everything. Right, we're just in our case, we can support things that use our technology.
Right, and basically, we want to develop a forum for doing studies.
Yeah,
and there's no way, and so the brain gauge was actually a product of science, and it wasn't a product developed to be a product.
Well, see, so Mark is kind of commenting between the lines here, because Ioannidis' concern is that if you develop something, a product that's to be commercialized, you have an inherent bias, and you have to prove that works.
Right.
Well, I got news for you, man. The biggest conflict of interest we could find, talking to one of the assistant deans here at the university, the biggest conflict of interest is actually getting federal funding.
Exactly.
Because everything you do with that, you have to make things work. So you have a huge bias. You have a huge need to make things work in order to keep funding. So it's not just commercial stuff. It's like anything that involves money or career advancement has a bias built into it.
Right. So his argument is that, lots of companies are putting money into their drugs and doing clinical trials on drugs and whatever they put research into.
You require things to be replicated independently, and you punish people who lie. Like, for example, there was a person from the FDA who said, she was asked point blank on the news about 2 months ago. I'll try to put a citation for this person with their name. Why it is that we ended up with the opioid crisis. And she said, flatly, the people who developed these opioids simply lied about the tendency to become addicted. They had studied it, they had the data, and they simply lied about it. So I would say that, what we need to do is...
Oh, we have to do a whole nother take now.
Yeah, no, we don't need to takes or anything like that. I would say we have to lost my train of thought. We have to punish people who lie about their data. We have to do that. The reason that, the Russians interfere with democratic elections, and the reason that people tell white lies about their data is because there's no consequences. It's all upside.
But anyway, back to who's more conflicted. Say somebody who develops a product and with the intent of pushing science out to where it's accessible by everybody, that would be us, versus the people who sit on a study section where they are part of the peer review process at handing out money. But in order to get a grant and in order to be on a study section, you have to have a grant. Once you get a grant, then you sit on study section. And it's sort of a good old boy club, but the people who are most vested, the people who are most conflicted are people that get NIH grants, because when they have that grant, they have to write papers. They have to, at all costs, get those publications out in order to get the next round of funding.
If you have negative findings, you can't publish them easily because of publication bias. You almost certainly can't publish them in a top-tier journal, which means all of a sudden you got to find a way to publish your data. And I have many colleagues who will literally take their data to a statistician and say, find my signal, find something in here that's significant that I can publish. So it's not like the study was well thought out or anything like that. It's just literally like a rescue attempt. And there's a strong bias. And you know what? You can change the findings of a study by tweaking just a couple data points. And I know many people do it. There you are at midnight, Christmas Eve. If this data point only was different by a few percent, you'd get significance. You'd be able to publish something, but you don't have it. So what do you do? And unfortunately, the answer is a lot of people will go in and tweak their data. That's called p-hacking.
So we no longer do brain gauge studies at my home university simply because the paperwork got too great. But in one of the meetings, the head of the conflict of interest office said, well, if you have something that works, then we have a problem.
It's a conflict, yeah.
If your research works, and if it looks like you have what is it long phrase? If you have the potential to have the appearance that something might be conflicted.
The appearance of the possibility of conflict is a conflict at the university, yeah.
But that doesn't apply to people getting funding from federal government and writing papers who are dependent on writing papers, because that certainly has a potential for the possibility of
Well, we brought this
conflict.
up with them. We said, this is a huge conflict of interest. And one of the people who worked in the dean's office said, yeah, this is the biggest conflict of interest in academia, is that everybody who has this funding has this conflict. You have to. So you have to manage it. And the answer is you have to get good people in science, good scholars, and you have to reward good scholarship, and you have to report results when you do an experiment and it doesn't work, because sometimes a negative result tells you more than a positive result, because it can tell you, hey, this thing that we all believed, it ain't true.
So here, next item. I know what you're going to say
Are you
on this
reading
one.
Again?
I'm reading. I got the glasses on. I might as well look. Get some wear and tear out of them. And I know exactly what Bob's going to say on this.
I'm so hard to predict.
He said,
I'm just going to come out of left field on this one now.
We just won't even. I won't even put it into context. But he says we do not spend enough.
My head's going to explode. We did not spend enough on what?
So his solution is to spend more.
Hire more administrators to inhibit the process of science. We do not spend enough. Okay, this is where I don't know where Mark falls on this spectrum, but I will say it again. I think with about a 90% cut, I don't just think this, I've calculated it. With about a 90% cut in the NIH budget, if the remaining 10% actually went to people doing science and allowed them to do the science they thought was important, it would still be pretty inefficient, because there's bad scholars out there, but you get much better science and you get much more of it. And that's a 90% savings from what we spend.
He does say that, it would make a more convincing case for science if science was run better. And he made
make a more convincing case for anything if it was run better.
Do you make everything, less?
Science is messy. Science is messy and inefficient. It has to be, because you have to be allowed to be wrong.
Yeah.
I remember. Did I ever tell you the story? Many stories. I'm an old guy who's had a stroke, so you gotta indulge me a little bit. Did I ever tell you the story about? I think it was second grade, and the teacher. No, it was third grade, and the teacher, a new teacher in my elementary school, said, "Well, I'm going to make the grading easy. I'm just going to grade you on how big your eraser is at the end of the year. Like if you've had made fewer mistakes and you've done fewer erasures, I'll give you a better grade," and that's it. And so her thinking was that the more you have to erase, the more mistakes you make.
That's what those things were for?
That's what those things were for.
I never used those things.
I used them up like crazy because I made mistakes all the time, So I said to her, and this is the first day, I'm in third grade, right? So I just walked up, I handed her my pencil and said, "I'm just not going to write anything. My eraser was 100% intact. Go ahead and give me a grade. Grade me now." And she looked at me, some smoke puffed out of her ears, does not compute. The point is that many people, maybe one of the two of you viewers is like this, and if you are, I'm sorry for you, but they can't wrap their mind around the fact that it's okay to make mistakes. And science largely is the art of carefully crafting your questions so that they can be wrong and still tell you things that are very important.
Okay, here's the last thing we'll talk about. The other points on that are different from what we've already covered. But we don't fund high-risk ideas.
That's absolutely true.
That is definitely true. So
he's
now's the time to talk about what is incremental research.
Oh my God!
And
don't get me started. Absolutely. I'm going to let you in on something. I've been at many universities now, at Harvard, MIT, and Michigan, and Carolina. I've been around a little bit, and gone to the new faculty meetings, sort of a little cheerleader session for, rah, 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 welcome to the faculty, and let us give you advice. And in every one of them, there was some senior researcher who would come up and tell you about how to do research, specifically how to get research funding, not like how to actually contribute to humanity and be a good scholar and scientist or anything like that, but how to get funding. Because if you're getting funding, they use that as a proxy measure for your scholarship, because it's easy. Any bean counter can say this person has this amount of money, that means they're that good of a scholar, which of course is nonsense. Do you know that every single one of them, I started asking this question to make sure they would answer it. Should I really focus on high risk, really important research? And they always tell you, no. Do small incremental stuff, carve yourself out a niche so that you're the expert at like one part of one protein or whatever it is you're doing research on. And they will tell you right up front when you're a new faculty member, don't try to save the world. Don't try to make any big contribution. Play the safe game, the long game. Do incremental research, and that incremental means baby steps.
I have a funny story about this.
You have a funny story?
Yeah.
I thought it was my domain.
Yeah, it was your bill. Yeah, whatever. But when we first started developing our technology, the brain gauge methods, I put in grant application to NIH, and I think I forget what it was for. It was pain or migraine or concussion or something like that. One of those things. Well, or autism. But anyway, put the grant in, and NIH has actually started this thing where you get a novelty score or creativity score. Yeah. Innovation. How innovative is this? That's what it is. And so they give us this, you know what I'm going to tell you. But anyway, the first grant in there, this is just too way out there. This is crazy stuff.
So they actually tell you, go ahead and innovate, man. Think outside the box and everything like that. But then when you do, whack, you get
Okay, and
slapped
so
down.
this particular mechanism said, okay, we only accept pilot data, maybe, and you can't have a well, they told me you have to have a publication because this is just too wacko. And it's like, all right, so we get a publication, we go in there, and they go, well, it's still kind of wacko. We need to see more. Put in more data. Well, meanwhile, a year goes on, whatever, we've gone through on the third cycle or whatever, and the comment was, well, this isn't innovative anymore. Everybody's doing it.
I love that one.
There's a lot of labs using your methods.
By the time he stuck his neck out and put his own money down and made it work and everything, by the time he was able to prove it sufficiently to them, it was already passé, you know. And it went, that was hilarious. I was actually there when he sort of, you know, opened the letter, as it were, and he's like, what? So this is this kind of stuff. So anytime you see, like, on TV or some kind of ad for research, and, you know, oh, you know, or you hear a news story about, you know, where they're really funding, you know, high risk, you know, high reward research and stuff like that. BS.
Well, high risk research means NIH ain't going to fund it.
No,
until it's no longer innovative.
That's right. Until it's no longer innovative, and that has to be being done by a senior person, because they're the only ones who can do it right anyway. That's what they think. So the fact is, they say this, they you know, pay a lip service, but the NIH does not fund innovative research. There's a long list of research that they turn down at first, saying this will never work. I mean, and it's most of the major advances in science, like transgenic animals is one of them. They wrote a scathing, this was published actually, they wrote a scathing response to the guy who proposed transgenic animals, which is sort of the bread and butter of genetics research now. Okay, is the use of transgenic animals, and he said, you know, very meek, you know, he said, well, you know, we could do this, we could do that, we could see what happens when you change genes and stuff. He wrote this scathing, like, this is nonsense, this will never work. This was about 40 years ago. And, of course, then he made it work, and now it's basically the basis for all genetic research, practically. And, you know, they were dead wrong about that. And they're dead wrong about so many things. I could go on forever. Maybe I will. You know, I don't know. You got all day.
We should probably stop at some point. Anyway, this is one reason that we are going to talk about in another video at some point about crowdsourced science, where we're really not looking for funding. We're looking for participants. And we're looking for a forum, because everybody's got some expertise in something.
Well, when you do a study with humans,
well,
this is true. You know, when you do a study with humans, if you do a formal study that's all, you know, jumps through all the hoops and everything, you're talking about a general rule of thumb. It's $50,000 or $60,000 per participant, especially for any kind of biomedical research. And crowdsourced funding can be done for a heck of a lot less than that if you're not supporting some big university structure and some big paperwork structure. You can implement all the controls and safety controls and privacy controls pretty inexpensively, and then you know, people can participate because they're interested and they want to contribute, and that's what we're interested in. We're interested in, I think that's the future of medicine, medical research anyway.
Yep.
So,
anyway, we should quit.
All right, we should stop now, because
for the one or two people still watching or fell asleep.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Turn the computer off.
We'll see you next week on Grumpy Science.
See ya.